It's real. It's real. You know the deal. You know the deal. Come on.
Hey, it's Shantae.
And I'm Natalie, and welcome to What's the Deal, a podcast powered by The Norfus Firm. At The Norfus Firm, we solve people problems. We have the pleasure of working with employers all around the world on HR and diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. So we keep elevating because we have someone in person today. We're really excited. I was like, we're going to introduce you, but you're going to sit here in the queue while we do that. But here we are. Yeah. So we have been on this journey around allyship. Mm-hmm. And when we started the conversation, it really is with this baseline thought of why don't we work on making sure the people who need allyship are incorporated into what allyship looks like. So we've had incredible guests of all different backgrounds. Today is no exception. Very, very excited to have Clive Chang with us today. Clive is the president of YoungArts, which is the only nonprofit in the country that supports young artists across 10 disciplines. Super, super close to my heart. We've worked with YoungArts for years now. I have a young artist. I'm an artist. My dad's an artist. You were a young artist.
Shout out to Miami Magnet Schools.
Exactly. Yeah. Shout out to New World.
New World School of the Arts.
So, this is so special because we are so tied to art, and art doesn't always get the love it deserves. And in some ways, I look sometimes at artists as marginalized groups because, especially in this country, it's like you need to pick something more noble, right? You can't really be an artist. That's not a job.
Right.
And I love that YoungArts unpacks that notion and really discards it. When we look at Clive, gosh, I have 3 words that I wrote down when I think about Clive. Ooh. Yeah. You ready? So infectious, tenacity, and fluidity.
Yeah.
And so let's talk a little bit why. Now, the tenacity is you'll see he's infectious. He'll prove that.
He doesn't say anything.
Exactly.
Infectious in the context of COVID is a little bit scary.
Not that kind of infectious, just that energy. But from a tenacity standpoint, so Clive was born in Hong Kong, moved to Toronto, didn't speak English, went through a whole grade of school without speaking English somehow. But that's, I think, goes to the tenacity piece. Started learning French at 9, so multilingual, moved to the US, went to school in Montreal, convinced the dean of his school that he could do 2 degrees in 5 years instead of 8. Just we're gonna get stuff done, right? And so you add to that being a very talented musician. And I do have to tell a very brief story of we helped in the recruiting process for Clive to get the role. And we do chemistry discussions, shout out to really strong recruiting practices so you can see how people lead. Of course, Clive shined, but then Clive also hopped on the piano, really just turned this into a full-blown, you cannot hire anyone besides me, and demonstrated sort of the brilliance of his.
Literally gave no option. There couldn't have been a more perfect person for that particular job.
Exactly.
You were born for it.
And so for me, that brings about this reminder when I think about all that you've done and all that you do, it really hits that point that we are not one thing.
Right.
And that's where the fluidity comes in, right? Business degree, worked in big business, also a professor, also a musician, nonprofit leader. We don't have to be a thing. And I think that goes so well with, what YoungArts does. So I'll turn over to Shantae. We love shared language, right? So we want to start where everyone's starting from a same starting point.
Yes. So before we get into that, in your own words, because Natalie did a great job of teeing it up, I would love to hear you talk about you and what you would like us to know about you. And then we can get into the allyship discussion around how you define allyship based on your own lived experience and what allyship means to you.
Yeah, thank you. That is a very generous introduction, so thank you for that. Truly, the only thing I would say, both in addition and as a framing tool, is that I approach everything I do as a human from the point of view of an artist. Mm-hmm. And that extends to my role as a CEO of an organization. And I think of myself in some ways, it's a little bit of an overused analogy, but somewhat as a conductor of an orchestra, but not even maybe sometimes as a conductor, more like an ensemble member who just tries to bring my colleagues and peers along in support of a magical vision and journey of an organization. So that's what I would say. I identify first and foremost as an artist, and that sort of carries through everything I do.
Amazing. And so if you're thinking about position, like approaching the world from an artist perspective and everything that comes with that, what does allyship look like in that framing?
Yeah, I think of allyship on a few levels. Like first and foremost, the baseline for me is some demonstration that you care. Like to me, that's like level 1, right?
Yeah.
I think I would say like level 2 is a consistent practice of proactive empathy. And I think that there's an important framing of proactive there, because it's not just empathy, it's like a practice of doing it proactively, right? And then, I'm on my own journey on this spectrum, and I feel like the next level up for all of us is then to do all of that with the conscious consideration of power, of privilege, of difference, of how the world is evolving, how humans are evolving, how civic dialogue is evolving or not evolving. It's actually going backwards, right? So I kind of just think of it in layers and in levels.
I love that you highlight that it's a practice. That concept has come up in a couple of interviews that we've had, and it's this thought and this act of the consistent effort that you put into showing up in a certain way, and which also aligns obviously with being a musician. That's all we did was practice. That's all we do is practice, right? So
the metronome to tick,
exactly,
to tick.
And constantly running the scales and all those things. So, in what have you seen in your experience in terms of folks practicing this proactive practice of empathy, and how has that shown up in your experience and benefited you?
Yeah, I would say what I appreciate the most, and I don't even know if on the giver's end that this was intended as specifically a practice of allyship, but I often love receiving questions that very much allow me to answer it from my own angle, or for just allow me to answer it however I want to answer it, and less of a leading question. For example, instead of asking me, wait, so are you an immigrant? How's that affected you? Ask me, tell me, I want to hear about your life journey. And how's that just shaped what's important to you today? Not even like, how's that shaped what you do? Or how's that shaped your music making? Or how's it like, let me decide to talk about music making and don't prescribe it to me, right? So I do think that when I think back to some of the most thoughtful, whether explicit or unintended or, somewhat implicit acts of allyship have come from those moments that just give me more agency as a person in how to respond.
So I think when you think about that, right, it's this layer, it's what we talk about. Actually, it's the beginning, like we're not one thing. And that it sounds like, it's like when people are approaching you with an empathetic curiosity, because I'm adding empathetic because sometimes people are curious in a way that feels like there's like an ill intent behind it.
Yeah.
But if they're truly curious to know who you are and not a component of you, it sounds like that feels like a form of allyship.
For sure. Absolutely. Absolutely.
You brought up the idea of agency. And that's really important when it comes to allyship, because we've seen it show up where folks, it sounds a little like maybe patronizing or patriarchal, where folks try to put on you what they think you need.
Yes.
But in allyship, there's this concept of agency and voice. It's really, really important. And so, if we think about, before we actually got started, you shared an example with us of something that had happened in a prior job situation where there was a meeting and someone said something off key, just again, music reference, inappropriate. Like I did that. And so, it wasn't about you, but you could, in a roundabout way, maybe it was about you. And so there was an opportunity for a discussion or for it to be addressed in a certain way for someone who's more of an ally, someone who could stand in that space. There was also a power dynamic at play potentially. Yeah. So someone definitely needed to come in and at least hold space for a conversation that needed to happen. what would you have liked to happen? Because it sounded like when we talked about it, it didn't turn out the way that you would have maybe preferred. But how would you have liked that ally to show up?
Yeah, and of course, hindsight's
Absolutely.
2020. And also, I've changed since then and evolved since then. And I can also think of ways in which I feel like I would counsel my younger self to have done something slightly differently. But just to go back and like recreate the scene, this is my first job as an executive, right? This is like the first job that I would consider myself as having been part of an executive team. I was also the most junior member of said executive team of maybe like 12 people, let's call it. I believe the only person of color, the youngest, right? And so there were all of these insecurities that I had being in the room in the first place. Sure. And then there was a moment where there was a reference made that alluded to skin color, right? And I was the only person in the room that sort of that skin color reference would have alluded to. And I think the room understood the situation enough to know that that wasn't an okay comment to have been made. The action at the time was deflection. It was like, oh, ha, 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 don't mind that person. Oh, ha, 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 oh, yeah,
Right, sweep it under the rug, yeah.
Right, and I also just kind of froze. And when I think back to what would have been very powerful for me in that moment, I think it would have been for someone who was also in a position of power to have directly acknowledged it, not in a dramatic way. Like no one needed to pound the table and say, that was... I think I just would have appreciated somebody acknowledging in a matter-of-fact, rational, calm way that was not an acceptable comment to have been made, and it shouldn't happen again. And then we immediately move on to the next agenda topic, like whatever we were talking about, right? So just that, like, in a way, the less dramatic it is, the better. I think the sort of the way to address the situation. Right. Like, don't make it a whole thing, right? Just like, that's not okay. All right, let's move on.
So a couple follow-ups there. So when you think about the piece around freezing, you had also talked about that sometimes it takes a moment to like really recognize like how it impacted you. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of like you freeze, but then what?
Yeah, I think I described it to you earlier as like delayed onset. Mm-hmm. There's sort of like this startling moment of like, what just happened, right? And then only an hour later, do you realize, wait a minute, that really bothered me, right? And so I also think that's another, I also think about this, it's like, I also don't want anybody to be angry on my behalf if I'm not angry in the moment, right? And so that's why I say, let it be a matter of fact thing. Mm-hmm. Don't let it be emotional, right? If, also I may not have been the only person offended by that comment. So I also just, even if it was specific to my race or specific to my skin color or whatever, right? So, so many sort of layers, but I do think all of us process information and emotion in different ways and at different paces, and that's okay too.
And I think that gets back to even a concept that we've talked about before with this idea of a delayed onset, is that it's not just the comment itself, right? It's then the time you spend mulling over it later. And I think it's important for allies to understand that, the job is not necessarily done in that moment, right? Hey, not cool, we're not cool with that, and moving on type of thing in the moment, that makes you feel seen and acknowledged, but it doesn't mean that you're not going to mull over it again later, right? Because the sting, happened. That, I think the allyship helps to diffuse the sting. But then again, when you're like processing it later, because we've had those conversations where we're like, wait, right? Like,
wait a minute.
Is that what they meant?
Right?
And then you're like, because I think in probably in human natures, you want to assume good intent, right? Like you don't want to come at it from, and also we're kind of conditioned to like, a lot of people of color, marginalized folks have been gaslit that's not what that means.
Right.
Right. And even that, oh, that's just how he is. It's like, okay, it's not cool. Like, I don't appreciate it.
Yeah,
right.
it's not
so
cool.
there's a lot of these layers of processing that I think are important for allies to keep in mind too, because yes, you're doing your part, but recognize that may not be the fix, so to speak, because the person you're advocating on behalf of may still be processing, because it's often not the first time.
Yeah.
Right. And I want to just, that after part is something that's really interesting for me in this allyship conversation. So the thing happens, it either gets addressed or doesn't get addressed in the moment, but then there's an after where you're mulling it over. Is there support that you would have liked to have had there, or what makes sense? Again, this is obviously from your perspective, but if you're looking for support, what does that look like after an incident has happened?
Yeah. Yeah. And I will say in this particular case, I did receive an invitation of after support, which I think is the best thing.
Okay.
It's not a, like, I am going to help you now, right? It's a, let me know, I don't want to impose upon you, but I recognize that that may have been a challenging moment. Take your time and let me know what you need, right? From me or from whatever. So I think that invitation is important,
right?
As long as it's not, a prescription.
Yeah.
I like that, not imposing.
Yeah.
That gets at what we're talking about, right? Like to not center yourself.
That part.
In the support.
And I did want to go back to agency and the idea of imposing, because I think of some other moments in my career where I think people thought they had the best intentions. I think they were really intending to champion me and help me, but the execution was just a little bit of an imposition, to use that word, right? For example, so wonderful, like, Clive, we're gonna have you present this, whatever, to the chairman. It's gonna be wonderful, you're gonna be great, and you're gonna sit in this seat at the head of the table, and da-da-da-da-da-da, right? And okay, that's great. I happen to not believe in that seat of the table. I don't like rectangular tables, I like round tables, because at round tables, there's no explicit or implicit sort of like power dynamic. So we're sitting in a circle, kind of like in an ensemble. And I happen to, as a leader, wield my influence laterally. I don't wield it vertically, or, and so my preferred seat is at the center of the table, preferably at a round table. And I've achieved my best work truly from the center of the table, because that's where it allows me to bring together and sort of pull out voices as they come in support of making a decision or moving forward on a particular topic. And so I think about instances like that. I also think about moments in time where whether it's counseling me on being more, the code word is assertive. And I'm just like, I don't know what you mean by that. Like, I find myself plenty assertive. So what do you mean by that? And I do think there are some cultural behaviors that come into play that, again, sometimes are imposed upon those of us who are not brought up in a Western culture. So in Asian culture, we are actually raised to pay deference to the elder, to pay deference to more experience and greater wisdom and longer lived experience. And I think we're conditioned to be much more active listeners before then we respond. And I think in a Western context, sometimes that just gets it gets twisted into like meekness. It's like you should have jumped in there. Like you should have spoke your mind in the beginning. And it's like, well, should, like really should?
Right.
Right?
People shit all over themselves all the time, don't they?
That's a good phrase. And like in the moment, I kind of want to be like, so your feedback is I should just be more like a white man. Is that what you mean? So
Ooh, that is a whole whole other podcast.
Yeah, right?
You're coming back.
Yeah, definitely coming back, because that is we encounter that a lot in terms of like this whole like white dominant culture and those characteristics and what that means and all of that. And so that's a really, really important topic that you bring up.
Which is why when I'm listening to this, it brings me back to like, you know, one of the big rules around allies or allyship is don't center. Like, don't make it about like what you would do in this situation. So then that means that's what you should do, which should is such a terrible word for many reasons, but it is so binary, right? It suggests that there's only one way to be and one way to do it. And so I think when I'm listening to you, it's like, no, but this goes back to the beginning. If you're curious and you're getting to know me, then you'll start to, through that process of trust building, understand that there are cultural differences in the way that you approach, right? This is that proactive piece that you're talking about, right? Yeah. Like where we don't need to get to these moments of, oh, you should have spoken your mind. And because it's like, then you have a better understanding of who I am. Yeah. If you're really caring about me as the person, not me as the concept, right? Yeah. Because when you're thinking about it from that angle of you should have, it's like you're a concept as opposed to like a human being with your own ways of looking at things. Yeah. So we have one last question. But I feel like we could have 50 last questions.
No, we could keep going. I was just thinking to myself, like, wow, this could be hours. This is a multi-part series. Exactly. I'm into it.
Yeah. Super into it. So you had a quote. You had to me, one of the funnest intro videos as president. Like the video you put together was so infectious, energy-wise, and authentic. And it was also serious. It was this cool, like many parts to it. And when I say serious, it was clear that you were going to take great care with this organization. And there was a quote that you made that I think is beautiful and also interesting to this conversation, where you noted, I approach leadership from the perspective of a collaborative artist. Much like an ensemble, different voices take turns coming to the forefront. When I read that after having heard it, to me, it's such a beautiful way to describe diversity, right? And that there's different voices, different parts that people play, and diversity really in the broad sense. And I know that diversity is very important to you. And so when we think about that quote and that approach, do you see your leadership style as a form of allyship?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say yes. Like, truly, I'd like to think of myself as an ally to all. And, you know, we can get into another several hours of discussion about how one can maybe drive themselves crazy and spread themselves too thin when they try to be an ally to every single, you know, being on this earth. But I do, truly. And I think, you know, our organization's about 50 staff. And I think I truly can be an ally to all 50 staff. Not to mention all of the brilliant young artists that come through Young Arts year after year, and then through the rest of their lives. So I think it's a matter of understanding, like at the core, how do I best be an ally to myself? Then how do I exhibit reciprocal allyship, right? Because I think everything is two-way. And how do I give that generosity so that I deserve it in return? And then how do I, on a systemic level, just sort of like build out layers of processes, structures, and sort of culture that can invite easy, sort of like take down the barriers to participating in this practice, and just radiate it out into the world, and hopefully it will, right, in some small way, help make the world a better place.
You said something really impactful that I think it also hits another point, the two-way piece. Yeah. Because we want to be careful too to say that marginalized people are not victims, right? We're not saying like, save us and we're infantile. What we are saying is that share your power, right? So if you see something happening where I'm maybe one of only in a room, the example from your meeting, step in. But if there's something you can do to step in for that person, that's that reciprocal piece. And we do regularly. And I think that's sometimes where some of these conversations come, right? Like we push for the allies because the marginalized folks are typically working overtime in terms of trying to help a lot of different people across different issues, right? So I appreciate that point, because I think we also have to be careful to say, we're not saying we don't have power. We're just saying, if you're in situations with marginalized folks, keep in mind you may have a different or more elevated form of power than them. And then the fatigue piece. I know I said last question, but I am going to ask you this question. So this idea of wanting to help everyone, and we've talked about this before, because sometimes where leaders can shut down is that because there are so many different layers to people, where they grew up, the language they speak, their ethnicity, their gender expression, all of these different things, that a leader might say, I can't be an expert in all that.
Right.
Even if they want to help, they might shut down. So what's your thought about that in terms of avoiding exhausting yourself or shutting down because it feels like it's too much?
I think it's really just about not, I don't know if this will come across the wrong way, but if there is one really unique superpower in a person that I think that is underappreciated and I can help bring that out, I think I've sort of demonstrated the practice of being an ally. And I don't have to know every single thing about every single person, but if I can just really at least attempt to have that one kind of thing. And I do think of this in that musical ensemble analogy of what's beautiful about a musical ensemble is that there truly is, when you're playing in it and it's time for the cello to have its moment, there's a reverence to that moment for the cellist. And in the same way, I feel like in an organization, there's this one really interesting context in which this particular staff member shines. Let's bring that to the surface and give it its due reverence. And even in being able to surface it so that others can take notice, I think that's being an ally, to create the context in which you make it easier for others to observe and to see and to appreciate and to notice. I think that's being an ally. And so I don't know. I feel like I haven't really answered your question.
No, that answers the question. It's take a bite-sized piece. Yeah. That's how I play that back, right? What's the one thing you can focus on? And in your example of identifying someone's superpower, we've talked about this with a few folks that work for you. What's the thing? Seeing that in that person helps them to feel seen. And then it's not so much about, we have to know your heritage and all the things, which are great to know if a person's comfortable sharing, but really this idea of, I see you. That's what my takeaway is from that, is that develop a practice of seeing people. And it's going to be unique to how you lead, but it doesn't have to be this, I can do any and everything. What do you think about that?
I love that part. And I also love the idea of the ensemble supporting that person or that part in the piece, where it's either solo or it's maybe that those instruments have a really important part. And to me, my attention goes to, how does the rest of the ensemble, the organization, or whatever it is, support that moment? And so people are still playing. It's not like everyone's dropped out, right? People are still playing. People still have there's harmonies, there's all sorts of things happening underneath to really allow this moment to come through and shine. And that part really struck with me, because I think sometimes get to the point people see it and they're like, okay, this person has the floor and then that's it, let me back off. It's like, no, you still play a role. And it's very important to allowing that person to really fully shine. So
Absolutely.
I really love
that.
Conte.
Yeah, that's great. That's amazing.
This is always the hardest part, because we got to wrap
up.
Exactly.
So let's just play back here a few things that I think were really powerful from what we've talked about. I think the practice of proactive empathy is a huge takeaway here. That practice, we talk about it a lot. We talk about it in obviously being musicians. We talk about that in terms of breath work, mindfulness. All of it, It's something that if you don't do it little bit every day, you're not going to ever be super great at it, right? So it's like anything else. So, and being proactively empathetic is so action oriented, right? It allows you to, that phrasing just allows someone to act on it. Don't be an imposition. Yeah. So when you're offering up allyship, not putting it in a way where it creates more work for the person that you're intending to help, or that doesn't consider them as a person, right? I love this chair analogy of culturally, I don't want to be at the head of the table. And so we should be able to find other ways to demonstrate power that are respectful of where people come from. And then that last piece of what we were just talking about around identifying one thing that you can sort of use as your practice, whether it's identifying a really strong talent and like a strong skill set in your team and really seeing that person in that way and helping them see themselves in that way. I think those are three really powerful ways to approach allyship that brings in the person or the group that you're intending to help. We love you. You're always welcome here.
Thank you.
We can't wait to have you back. And stay tuned for more. We will be back.